The morning Grace Merriweather buried her second water pump in 6 years. She stood at the edge of her property with her hands on her hips and stared at the cracked earth as though she could convince it to behave through sheer force of will. And for a moment she almost believed she could. That was the thing about Grace. She had survived things that would have felled a lesser woman, and she had survived them alone, without complaint, without asking a single soul for help. She was 32 years old, lean from hard work and straight-backed from pride, with dark chestnut hair that she kept pinned up during the day and let fall past her shoulders at night when there was nobody to see it. Her hands were rough and her boots were worn, and her eyes were the color of a storm moving in from the west, that particular shade of gray-green that couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be. It was the spring of 1882 in Harlan County, Texas, and the land out here did not care about widows or grief, or the fact that a woman had been keeping 60 head of cattle alive through drought and dust, and one catastrophically bad winter without any help whatsoever. The land simply demanded things of you, and you either met those demands or you were swallowed up by the red Texas soil and forgotten about entirely. Grace was not going to be forgotten about. Her husband, Thomas Merriweather, had died 6 years ago from a fever that moved through the county like a thief in the night, taking the young and the strong without warning or apology. He had been 31 years old and full of plans, and Grace had loved him the way you love the ground beneath your feet, quietly, completely, without ever thinking it might not be there. She had been 26 when he died, with a 4-year-old daughter named Clara, and a ranch that Thomas had been building from nothing for 3 years. She had stood at his grave on a cold October morning in 1876, and she had made herself a promise that she would not let everything he had built crumble into the dust. She had kept that promise every single day since then, even when it cost her almost everything she had. Clara was 10 now, sharp and quick-minded the way her father had been, already helping with the lighter chores before school and asking questions that Grace didn't always have ready answers for. She was a good girl, and Grace was fiercely proud of her. And on the nights when the work felt impossible and the loneliness settled into Grace's chest like a stone, she would look at Clara sleeping and remind herself that this was why she kept going. But today, looking at the ruined pump and calculating what a new one would cost against what she had in the tin box under her bed, Grace felt the weight of 6 years of solitary decision-making settle onto her shoulders like a physical thing. Every choice she had ever made on this ranch had been made alone. Every fence post driven, every calf birthed, every negotiation with the feed merchant in town, every sleepless night wondering if she had made the right call, all of it had been hers alone to carry. She was strong enough to carry it. She had proven that beyond any reasonable doubt, but sometimes she was just so tired. She was still standing there, calculating and planning and organizing the next several months of work in her head, when she heard the sound of hooves on the road that ran along the edge of her property. She turned to look without much interest, because riders came through this stretch of country fairly regularly, and she had long since stopped paying them much attention. This one pulled up at the fence line, though. He was a tall man on a bay horse, wearing a wide-brimmed hat the color of old tobacco and a duster that had seen considerable use. He had the look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors, deeply tanned, unhurried in his movements, with the particular kind of stillness that some men who rode alone developed over years on the trail. She put him at somewhere around 35, though the sun made it difficult to judge precisely. He was not conventionally handsome in the way that Thomas had been, but there was something about the directness of his gaze and the set of his jaw that made you feel like he was entirely present, entirely focused, like most of the world ran at a fraction of the attention this man deployed. He touched the brim of his hat. "Morning, ma'am. I'm looking for the Dewhurst place." "Would you know it?" His voice was low and unhurried, the way Texas men's voices often were, carrying the particular cadence of the high plains. "You've ridden past it," Grace said, "about 2 miles back, Large red barn, you can't miss it." "Much obliged." He didn't move right away, though. He was looking at the ruined pump with the attentive expression of someone who noticed things automatically. "That pump give out on you." "This morning," Grace said, in a tone that did not invite further discussion on the matter. He nodded slowly, reading the tone accurately, and touched his hat again. "Good day to you, ma'am." He rode on, and Grace watched him go with the faintly irritated feeling she always got when someone witnessed her having a hard day, and then she went inside to write down the figures for a new pump and feel terrible about them. She did not expect to see him again. But 3 days later, he appeared at her gate. She was in the yard repairing a section of the fence near the house, her sleeves rolled up despite the heat, focused on the work with the kind of single-minded attention that had gotten her through 6 years of impossible tasks. She heard the hooves and looked up, and there he was again on the bay horse, and she had the odd sensation of having expected him, which made no sense at all because she had no reason to expect anyone. He dismounted at the gate and she walked toward him, wiping her hands on her work trousers. "Mrs. Merriweather," he said. He had removed his hat, which surprised her, because a lot of men did not bother with that kind of courtesy when they were calling on someone they considered a business matter rather than a social one. "My name is Roscoe Boone. I've been working the Dewhurst place for the past week, helping Hank with some fence repairs and stock management. He mentioned you'd had some trouble with a pump." "Hank Dewhurst talks too much," Grace said, which was not untrue. Roscoe Boone almost smiled at that. Not quite a full smile, but the corners of his mouth moved in a way that suggested he was familiar with the phenomenon of Hank talking too much. "He does, ma'am. He also mentioned that you have the best cattle in the county and that you're too proud to ask for help." Grace looked at him steadily. "Both of those things are true, Mr. Boone." "The cattle part and the pride part." "I thought so," he said. "Which is why I'm not offering to help you. I'm offering to sell you my labor. I know pumps. I know the mechanism. I know how to repair them when they can be repaired. And I know how to install new ones when they can't. The one you have out there looks like it's been fighting this ground water for a long time. I'd wager it can be fixed rather than replaced, but I'd need to look at it closer to be sure." Grace regarded him for a long moment. He had brown eyes, she noticed now, not the kind of brown that was forgettable but the kind that was warm and alert in equal measure, the kind that looked at a problem and saw it clearly without flinching. "What's your rate?" she asked. He named a fair figure. Lower than what the man in town would have charged, and she had worked with enough hired hands over the years to know the difference between someone discounting out of pity and someone charging honestly. This felt like the latter. "All right," she said. "Come look at it." He followed her to the pump, and he crouched down and examined it with the thorough, unhurried attention he seemed to give everything, not speaking for several minutes, just looking and testing and thinking. Grace stood to the side and watched him work, and she noticed that he did not look to her for permission or approval as he went, which she appreciated. She disliked men who turned everything into a performance of consideration. "The leather washer's gone," he said finally, straightening up. "And there's some corrosion on the cylinder here, but it's surface corrosion, not structural. You don't need a new pump, Mrs. Merriweather. You need new parts and about half a day's work." Something loosened slightly in Grace's chest. "And what are those parts going to cost?" He told her, and the number was considerably better than what a whole new pump would have run her. "Do you have the parts?" she asked. "Not on me," he said, "but I can get them from the supply merchant in Caldwell. I'm heading back through town at the end of the week." "I can bring them then if that suits you." It suited her very well, though she did not say so effusively. She said, "That will do, Mr. Boone," and he put his hat back on and rode away, and she stood watching him go with that strange sensation again, the one she could not name and did not entirely trust. He came back on Friday afternoon with the parts, and he fixed the pump with the quiet competence of a man who had been solving practical problems his whole life. Clara came out of the house at some point and sat on the fence near the pump, watching him work with the unabashed curiosity of a 10-year-old. asking questions in a steady stream that most adults would have found exhausting. Roscoe Boone answered every one of them seriously and completely, without the condescending simplification that adults often used with children, and Grace, watching from the porch, found herself thinking that she liked that about him considerably. "How come you know how to fix pumps?" Clara asked. "Spent 3 years working on a ranch in New Mexico where the water was harder to come by than gold," he said, tightening something with a wrench. "You learn what's keeping the water flowing pretty quick when the alternative is going without. Did you ever go without?" "Once," he said. "Didn't enjoy it. Learned my lesson." Clara seemed satisfied with this. "Mama never goes without water because she figures things out before they get that bad. She figured out last summer that the creek was going low, and she moved the cattle 2 weeks before anyone else did, and they were all fine." Roscoe Boone looked up at that and caught Grace's eye across the yard, and there was something in his expression that Grace couldn't quite categorize. Not admiration exactly, but close to it, or maybe it was simple recognition, the way you looked at someone when they confirmed something you had already suspected. He finished the pump that evening and tested it until the water ran clear and strong, and Grace paid him what they'd agreed. And then, because she had been raised with certain proprieties even if she had spent 6 years dismantling most of them, she invited him to stay for supper. She did not entirely know why she did it. She was not in the habit of inviting hired hands to supper. But something about the way he had talked to Clara, something about the way he had given her a fair price and fixed the thing that needed fixing without making a production of it, made her want to extend the courtesy. He accepted with the same straightforward quality he seemed to bring to everything, and he washed up at the pump he had just fixed and came to the table, and ate her cooking without flattering it unnecessarily or criticizing it. And he asked Clara about school, and listened to the answers with genuine attention. And he asked Grace exactly 2 questions about the ranch, both of them specific and practical. About the creek water Grace had mentioned, and about what she was doing about the grazing rotation given the dry conditions that year, and both questions were the kind that showed he had been thinking about her situation, rather than just being polite. She found herself answering in more detail than she usually offered, laying out her plans for the summer grazing, and at one point she said something about a decision she was turning over in her mind, whether to sell 8 of her older cattle now at a reasonable price or hold them through the summer, and hope the market improved in the fall. Roscoe Boone listened to everything she said. He did not jump in with an immediate answer. He sat with his coffee cup held in both hands, looking at the table, thinking about it in that quiet way of his. And then he said, "What does your gut tell you?" Grace blinked. Most men, when asked their opinion, gave it. They did not bounce it back like that. "I asked you what you think," she said, with a slight edge that she couldn't quite suppress. He looked up at her then directly with those warm brown eyes that saw things clearly. "I know you did," he said, "and I think you already know the answer. I think you've been sitting with this question long enough that your gut has an opinion on it, and you're just looking to hear it spoken out loud by someone else to make it feel more settled. So I'm asking what your gut says." Grace stared at him for a moment. It was, she thought, the most accurately perceptive thing anyone had said to her in 6 years. Maybe longer. She felt something shift inside her chest, quiet and significant, like a door opening in a room she had forgotten was there. "My gut says sell them now," she said, hearing herself say it with a certainty she had not realized she possessed until this moment. "The summer is going to be harder than last year. I can feel it in the grass already. Hold them through a brutal summer and they'll come out the other side worth less, not more." Roscoe Boone nodded. "Then sell them now. That's all you're going to say." "That's all I need to say," he said. "You've got a better read on this land than I do. I've been here a week. You've been here years. Your opinion carries more weight than mine on the specifics." Clara, who had been following this exchange with the intent expression of someone witnessing something she didn't fully understand but knew was important, said, "Mama always knows," with simple confidence, and Roscoe Boone looked at the child with an expression that Grace could only describe as genuine warmth. "She does," he agreed. Grace loved him for it. Not in the full, complete way she would come to love him later. Not yet. But in that first, small way that is really about recognition, about having a part of yourself that you had kept very quietly protected suddenly seen by another person and not diminished by the seeing. She loved him for that small, unexpected moment the way you love the first warm day in March, with the particular sweetness of something you had stopped expecting. She did not say any of this. She poured him more coffee and asked about his plans, and he told her that he had work lined up in Caldwell for the next month or so, various hands jobs on the smaller ranches in the area, nothing permanent. "Where are you from originally?" she asked. "Kansas," he said. "Before that, Missouri." "Before that, a lot of places." He said it without self-pity, just as a fact. "Family, parents both gone," he said. "No siblings, I've been on my own since I was 19. She was 32. He was 36, as it turned out, she asked directly, because she had never had much patience for dancing around practical matters. He answered directly, which confirmed everything she was beginning to suspect about how he operated. He stayed until the last light faded from the sky, and then he stood and put his hat on and thanked her for the meal, and he said it had been a genuine pleasure. And he said it the way a person says something true rather than the way a person says something expected. And Grace stood on the porch and watched him ride down the dark road and felt the quiet of the house settle around her when he was gone. And thought about how that quiet had been constant and complete for 6 years and had never bothered her until just now. She sold the cattle the following Tuesday. She got a good price. The summer was as brutal as she had feared. She did not see Roscoe Boone again for 3 weeks, which she told herself was completely irrelevant. She had work to do. The ranch did not pause because a man with warm brown eyes had said something perceptive at her supper table. She managed the summer grazing rotation with the careful precision of someone who had been reading this particular land for years, moved the cattle in the rhythm she had developed through seasons of careful attention. And when the other ranchers were struggling in August, she was not, because she had made the right decisions in advance. She made them alone, as always. She was good at it. She did not need anyone else to tell her what to do. But when Roscoe Boone rode up her road again on a Thursday in July, she noticed that the quiet of the house felt slightly different before he arrived and slightly different again after he left. And she thought about that with the careful honesty she applied to all difficult matters. He had come to tell her that Hank Dewhurst had offered him a semi-permanent position, but that he was uncertain whether to take it. He said this without preamble, sitting across from her at the kitchen table with his hat on his knee, looking at her with the directness that she had come to recognize as simply his nature. "Why are you uncertain?" she asked. "Hank's a fair man, but the work is limiting," he said. "I've been thinking about what the long game looks like for me, and I'm not sure working on someone else's land indefinitely is it." "What is the long game?" Grace asked. She was genuinely curious, not merely making conversation. He was quiet for a moment. "Something of my own," he said. "Land, a place that's mine. I've been working toward it for a while now, saving what I can." He paused. "But there's no point in having land if there's nothing you're building it toward, if it's just land." Grace understood that. She understood it very well. She had built this ranch because Thomas had dreamed of it, and then she had continued building it because Clara was here, and because the work itself had meaning, and because the land had become a part of her in a way she had not anticipated but could not imagine being without. "Take the position," she said. "While you save, having steady wages while you plan is better than uncertain wages while you plan." He looked at her for a moment. "That's good thinking." "I know," she said, and smiled for the first time in the conversation. And he looked at that smile with the attention of someone seeing something they had been waiting for, and she felt the warmth of his looking. After that, he came by more regularly. Not so regularly that it was strange or obvious, but every week or so, usually on a Sunday when neither of them had the pressing urgency of weekday work. He would ride over from the Dewhurst place, and they would sit on the porch and talk. Or he would help with something around the ranch that needed an extra set of hands, or occasionally he would join them for supper. Clara adored him with the wholehearted openness of a child who had spent most of her remembered life without a father figure and found, in Roscoe Boone's steady and genuine attention, something that she had not known she was missing. Grace watched this with complicated feelings that she examined honestly, because she had always been an honest woman even when honesty was uncomfortable. She liked him. She liked him in a way that was growing steadily past the point where she could describe it as simple appreciation for a decent man. She liked the way he thought, measured and careful but not slow. She liked the way he talked to Clara. She liked the way he treated her ranch with respect rather than the veiled suggestion that it was too much for a woman alone that she received from most of the men in the county. She liked the way he looked at the land, not as a prize to be claimed, but as a responsibility to be honored. She also had 6 years of self-sufficiency behind her, 6 years of making every decision alone and carrying every consequence alone, and the idea of allowing someone else to have influence over her life, to matter to her in a way that meant their absence would be painful, terrified her in a way she did not feel comfortable admitting even to herself. She had loved Thomas. She had lost Thomas. She had survived losing Thomas, but only barely, and only by turning herself into someone who did not need, who managed, who decided and planned and drove forward alone. She was not entirely sure she could unmake that person now, even if she wanted to. Even if standing on the porch watching Roscoe Boone explain the mechanics of a saddle cinch to an enraptured Clara made her feel something so sweet and aching that it was almost unbearable. August came in like a furnace, exactly as she had predicted, and the creek dropped to half its usual level, and Grace moved the cattle to the north pasture where the grass was still holding its green, and she managed everything with her characteristic precision and accepted no help she had not explicitly requested. On the last Saturday of August, a problem arose that she had not anticipated, and for the first time in 6 years, Grace Merriweather found herself genuinely uncertain what to do. It started with a man named Curtis Hadley. Hadley was a land broker who had come to Harlan County in the spring representing interests from back east investors looking to consolidate smaller ranches into larger operations that could be managed more efficiently and sold at profit. He had been working his way through the county for months, making offers, and most of the smaller landholders had either sold or were considering it. Grace had received his first letter in May and had set it on fire in the kitchen stove with the calm certainty of a woman who had no intention of selling what she had spent 6 years building. She had received a second letter in July and treated it the same way. But now Hadley appeared in person on her property, and he was accompanied by a man named Silas Webb who served as what he called a legal advisor and what Grace called an intimidation device, and they rode up to her house on a Saturday morning with the air of men who expected to be accommodated. Grace met them on the porch with her arms folded and her expression cool. Hadley was a city man doing his best to look like a country one, wearing new boots that had not yet shaped themselves to his feet and a hat that was too clean. He was around 40, with the well-fed look of someone who had always gotten what he wanted without having to dig it out of the ground himself. Silas Webb was younger, lean and watchful, with the slightly predatory stillness of someone trained in the law by someone who did not value ethics especially highly. "Mrs. Merriweather," Hadley said, with a pleasant smile that did not reach his eyes, "I appreciate you seeing us." "I don't recall inviting you," Grace said. "No, but we've been corresponding," he said, as though setting fire to 2 of his letters constituted correspondence. "And I felt it was time for a direct conversation. My clients are very interested in your property, Mrs. Merriweather. They're prepared to offer you a very generous price." He named a figure. It was, in fact, a generous figure. It was significantly more than the land's immediate market value, more than she could realistically get if she tried to sell it on her own terms. It was the kind of figure that, she knew, was designed specifically to be hard to refuse without sounding irrational. Grace stood there and looked at it from every angle her mind could reach, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was genuine uncertainty. Not about whether she wanted to sell, she did not want to sell, she was entirely clear on that, but about whether she could afford not to. There were real financial pressures building. The drought was costing her in ways she had managed but not entirely overcome. Clara would need schooling that cost money in a few more years. The ranch itself needed investment that she had been deferring. She had 6 years of experience making hard decisions alone and being right often enough to justify the confidence. But this was the kind of decision that carried consequences she could not entirely model alone, the kind that involved legal language she was not expert in, the kind where the size of the numbers made her internal calculations uncertain. "I need time to think," she said. "Of course," Hadley said pleasantly. "We'll be in town through the end of next week." After they rode away, Grace stood on the porch for a long time and looked at her land, at the grass she had managed through the drought, at the cattle she had built up from 30 head to 60, at the fence posts she had driven, and the repairs she had made and the pump that was now working perfectly, and had been fixed by a man with warm brown eyes who had told her she already knew the answer when she was the one asking. She thought about the decision she was facing. She turned it over and over, examining every angle. And for the first time in 6 years, Grace Merriweather wanted to ask someone else's opinion, not because she could not form her own, but because the decision was large enough and complicated enough that having another perspective would not be weakness. It would be wisdom. Thomas had taught her that. 2 heads were often better than one, not because either head was deficient alone, but because decisions of this magnitude deserved more than one angle of examination. She saddled her horse and rode to the Dewhurst place. Roscoe Boone was in the south field when she arrived, and he looked up from the fence section he was working on and watched her ride toward him with that attentive quality of his, reading her expression and her posture the way a man who paid attention read the things that spoke louder than words. "Something's happened," he said as she reined in beside him. "A land broker named Curtis Hadley came by this morning," she said, "with a legal man named Silas Webb. They made me an offer for the ranch." Roscoe said nothing, waiting. "It was a good offer," Grace said, "better than market value, the kind of offer designed to make refusal look foolish." Still nothing, just his steady gaze giving her space to lay it out. "I don't want to sell," she said. "I want to be very clear about that. This is Thomas's land, and it's Clara's inheritance, and it's mine, and I have spent 6 years keeping it alive, and I do not intend to hand it over to some investment consortium from back east so they can consolidate it into something large and faceless and profitable for people who have never put their hands in this soil." She paused. "But the financial pressure is real, and the offer is real, and I keep thinking that maybe I'm too close to this to see it clearly." She stopped. She looked at him. "I want your opinion," she said directly. "I am asking you for it." Roscoe was quiet for a long moment, the way he was quiet when he was thinking rather than hesitating. He set down the tool he was holding and folded his arms and looked at the middle distance, and Grace waited, because she had learned in the past 2 months that his silences were always purposeful. Then he turned his gaze back to her, and his eyes were warm and clear and direct. "What does your gut tell you?" he said. Grace stared at him. She felt a flash of something that was almost frustration, and then, almost immediately, the flash transformed into something else entirely, something warm and soft and overwhelming, because she recognized what he was doing, and she recognized why, and it was exactly right. He was not going to take this decision from her. He was not going to sit here and tell her what to do with her land, her life, her daughter's inheritance. He trusted her judgment. He respected her knowledge of her own situation. He was giving her the one thing she actually needed, which was the permission to trust herself. "My gut says to refuse," she said, and her voice was steadier now, the uncertainty clearing as she heard the words aloud. My gut says the financial pressure is manageable. I've managed worse. The drought is going to break. It always breaks. And the cattle I kept are healthy, and the ones I sold were sold at the right time, and the ranch is fundamentally sound. It's not without challenges, but it's viable. I know it's viable because I have been watching this land for 6 years, and I know what viable looks like and what it doesn't, and this is viable. Roscoe nodded. And I think Hadley's offer is deliberately designed to feel like more pressure than it is, she continued, the clarity building now, one piece clicking against the next. He's offering over market value not because he's generous, but because he wants the specific parcel. There's something about this land that matters to him beyond its simple value, and if I knew what it was, I'd have more leverage, but either way, the urgency he's creating is manufactured. It usually is, Roscoe said quietly. So I refuse, Grace said. I write him a clear, final refusal, and I make it plain that any further approach will be treated as harassment, and I send it through town where people can see that I handled it firmly, because men like Hadley rely on privacy to maintain pressure. Roscoe looked at her with that expression she had seen before, not quite admiration but close to it, or maybe it was simply recognition again, that quality of one honest person recognizing another. You already knew the answer, he said. And Grace loved him for that, fully this time, completely. The way a woman loves someone when she realizes, with sudden and irrevocable certainty, that she has been falling toward this person for months without entirely knowing it, that all the small moments, the pump and the supper and the Sunday afternoons and the way he talked to Clara, had been building toward this one, when she understood that he saw her, actually saw her, and thought that what he saw was worth honoring. She sat on her horse in the August sun and felt the full force of it, and she did not say anything for a moment because she needed a moment to contain it. Yes, she said finally, keeping her voice level. I already knew the answer. You didn't need my opinion, he said, and there was something in his voice now too, something careful and warm, as though he was handling something valuable. I needed to hear myself say it out loud, she said. There's a difference. He nodded. There is. They stood in the field for a moment, the sun pressing down on both of them, the sound of the cicadas in the grass, and Grace was acutely aware of him in a way that was physical as well as everything else. The line of his shoulders, the particular way he stood with one hand resting lightly on the fence post, the details she had been cataloging without meaning to for 2 months. I should get back, she said. I'll ride with you part of the way, he said, if you don't mind the company. She did not mind the company. She had not minded his company in a long time. They rode back toward her property in the late afternoon heat, the horses walking, not hurrying, and they talked about small things first, the state of the grass, the possibility of rain in September, Clara's recent triumph at the schoolhouse spelling competition. And then Roscoe said, without particular ceremony but with the careful quality of someone who has decided to be honest about something important, I'm thinking about that land of my own more seriously now. Grace glanced at him. In this county. There's a parcel on the other side of the creek from you, he said. About 80 acres. The owner is thinking about selling. The price is within what I can manage if I make some adjustments. Grace said nothing for a moment. The parcel he was describing was land she knew. She had looked at it herself, years ago, when Thomas had first been planning the ranch. It was good land, well watered, with a natural windbreak on the north side that made it more defensible against the cold snaps that came through in winter. That's good land, she said. I know, he said. I've been looking at it for a few weeks. He paused. It would put me fairly close to your property line. There was a quality to the way he said it, not declarative, not a proposition, but a fact laid carefully on the table between them, like a card placed face up with the clear intention that she could do with it what she would. Grace rode with that for a moment. She felt the warmth again, the same warmth that had been building in her chest for 2 months, and she thought about the 6 years of aloneness that had made her strong and about the loneliness that existed alongside that strength. And she thought about Clara asking Roscoe questions and Roscoe answering them seriously. And she thought about supper tables with another voice at them. And she thought about how much it had mattered in that field just now. Simply to say the thing she had already decided to someone who would receive it honestly. Close to my property line would be all right, she said. Roscoe Boone turned and looked at her, and he smiled a full smile this time, open and warm in a way she had not seen before, and it changed his face in a way that made something squeeze tight in her chest. "Good," he said. They reached the boundary of her land, and he said good evening, and she said good evening, and she rode the rest of the way home with the smile still working at the corners of her mouth. And when Clara looked up from the porch and said, "You seem different, Mama," Grace said, "I'm just pleased about the pump." And Clara looked at her with the sharp, dark eyes she had inherited from Thomas, and clearly did not believe this at all. Grace wrote the letter to Hadley that night, sitting at Thomas's old writing desk with the lamp turned up high. She wrote it in precise, measured language that left absolutely no room for ambiguity. She refused the offer firmly and finally, and stated that any further approaches would be reported to the county sheriff as harassment, and she signed it with her name in full, Grace Eliza Merriweather, and sealed it, and rode into town the next morning to deliver it personally. The look on Hadley's face when she handed him the sealed letter across the counter of the hotel where he was staying was, she thought, worth more than his offer had been. "Mrs. Merriweather," he said, with the careful pleasantness of someone recalibrating, "I hope you'll reconsider." "I have considered it," Grace said. "Thoroughly. My answer is in the letter, Mr. Hadley. Good day." She walked out of the hotel and down the main street of Caldwell, and she was aware of people watching her, women from the church circle, men from the feed merchant's porch, the sheriff himself leaning in the doorway of his office. And she walked straight and steady and entirely herself. And it felt, she thought, exactly as it should. She ran into Roscoe Boone outside the supply merchant's, which she had not planned but also was not entirely surprised by, because sometimes things arranged themselves. He was coming out as she was going in, and he looked at her expression and said, "Letters delivered." "Letters delivered," she confirmed. Something easy and warm moved between them, the shared satisfaction of a thing done correctly. "I spoke to the owner of the parcel today," he said. "We're close to terms. It might be settled by the end of the month." "That's good news," Grace said. "It is," he said. And then, after a beat, with the directness that was entirely his, "Would you have supper with me on Saturday? At the hotel dining room, not at your place. Somewhere that isn't work." Grace looked at him. She thought about everything she had been thinking about for 2 months, and she thought about the decision she had been circling, and she heard faintly his voice in her memory asking what her gut told her. Her gut told her yes. "Saturday," she said. "Yes." The hotel dining room in Caldwell was not elegant by the standards of the cities back east, but it was the finest thing Caldwell had to offer: clean tablecloths and candles, and a cook who had learned his trade somewhere with actual standards. Grace wore her better dress, the dark green wool that Thomas had bought her the winter before he died, and that still fit and still looked well on her. And she put her hair up in the style she wore for church rather than work. And she looked at herself in the small mirror in her bedroom and felt briefly a pang of something that was not quite grief but related to it, the awareness of time passing, of the person she had been before 6 years of solitude, of how much had changed. Clara, who was spending the evening at the Dewhurst place with the Dewhurst children, had braided a small section of Grace's hair before she left with the focused care of a 10-year-old performing an important duty, and Grace had let her, because it was sweet, and because Clara had looked so pleased afterward. Roscoe Boone was already at the table when she arrived, standing as she walked in, and he looked at her with an expression that Grace filed away carefully in some warm interior place that she had not opened in years. He was wearing a clean shirt and his best vest, and he had shaved, and she thought that he looked very well and also that she was glad he was not the kind of man who would mention that she looked well and make the evening awkward with it, even if she also thought, just slightly, that she would not entirely mind if he said it. He said it, quietly, simply, just after they had sat down. "You look beautiful, Mrs. Merriweather." And Grace, who had not heard those words in 6 years, felt them fall somewhere very deep and very quiet and sit there, warm and still. "Thank you," she said, with a steadiness she was genuinely proud of. They ate well and talked for a long time, ranging across things they had not discussed before. His years drifting after his parents died, the ranch in New Mexico where he had learned to be useful in every practical way, the cold winter he had spent in Abilene working a cattle drive that had gone sideways in 3 different ways, her early years in Texas before Thomas's death, her own childhood in Ohio, how she had come west at 19 with more hope than sense, and had found, to her ongoing surprise, that she belonged here in a way she had never belonged anywhere before. "The land has a way of claiming the people who are meant for it," Roscoe said. "You sound like you mean that," she said. "I do," he said. "I've been a lot of places. I know what it feels like when somewhere fits and when it doesn't. This county fits." He looked at her. "Some things here fit." Grace met his gaze and held it, and there was no performance in it and no coyness, just 2 honest people acknowledging something real. She asked him about his family, what he remembered of them. He talked about his father quietly and with evident affection, a man who had worked hard and died 2 young, different circumstances from Thomas, but the same essential loss. He talked about his mother with a gentle grief that was old and well-worn, the way grief becomes when you have carried it long enough that it shapes itself to you. She appreciated his honesty about it, the way he did not minimize or dramatize, just said what was true. She told him about Thomas. She had not talked about Thomas, really talked about him, with anyone since the first year after his death. She told Roscoe about the man Thomas had been, his energy, his plans, his particular way of laughing, the way he had taught her to read cattle the way you read weather, looking for the subtle signs before the obvious ones. She told him about the fever and about the morning Thomas died, and about what she had done that same afternoon, which was go out and mend a section of fence, not because it was urgent but because she needed her hands to be doing something that had an answer. Roscoe listened to all of it. He did not offer condolences in the stiff, ceremonial way that people did when grief was new. He listened with the same quality he brought to everything, complete attention, full presence, the acknowledgement of a thing being important not because it demanded response, but simply because it was real. "He sounds like a man worth missing," he said when she had finished. "He was," she said. "He really was." They were quiet for a moment, and the quiet was entirely comfortable, the kind that only exists between people who have reached some mutual understanding. "I'm not looking to take anyone's place," Roscoe said carefully. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not interested in being a replacement for something. I'm interested in," he paused, choosing his words with the precision he brought to everything. "I'm interested in what might be possible if you were also interested, on its own terms, something new." Grace looked at him for a long moment. The candlelight moved in the draft from the window, and somewhere behind them other diners talked and the cook moved in the kitchen, and the whole small, ordinary texture of the world continued on around them. "I'm interested," she said, "on its own terms." The smile again, warm and open, and she thought she could become very accustomed to that smile. September came in on a cooler wind, the drought beginning to relent the way she had known it would, and the grass came back with the slow stubbornness of things that had evolved to survive, and the creek level rose by 1/3 in 2 weeks, and Grace moved her cattle back to the home pastures and counted them and found them all healthy and well managed, and felt the particular satisfaction of having made the right decisions at the right times. Roscoe finalized the purchase of the parcel across the creek at the end of September. He signed the papers in town on a Tuesday and rode to her property that same afternoon to tell her, and there was something in his face when he arrived, something open and almost vulnerable, the look of a man who had just done something he had been working toward for a very long time and was still processing what it meant. "It's yours," Grace said, looking at him. "It's mine," he confirmed, and he said it with the careful wonder of someone who had grown up without anything permanent and was not entirely accustomed to the idea. "Come see it properly," she said. "The view from the East Ridge is better than from the road. You can see the whole lay of the land." They rode out together in the late afternoon, crossing her land and then the creek and then climbing to the East Ridge. And from there, the 80 acres spread out below them in the particular golden light of a Texas autumn afternoon. And it was, Grace thought, very good land, and it was his. She watched him look at it and thought about all the ways a person could be claimed by a place, and about the 6 years she had spent becoming claimed by her own piece of this earth, and about what it meant that he was going to be on the other side of the creek. "What will you build first?" she asked. "A house," he said. "Proper, not just a bunkroom, a house." He paused. "I've been thinking about what it should look like." "Have you?" "A porch on the south side," he said. "For the light, big kitchen." "You cook?" she asked, surprised. "Decently," he said. "A man living alone either learns to cook or he suffers." "And the stable, east side of the house," he said. "Close enough to hear if there's trouble, but not so close you smell it on a warm day." They talked about the construction, about the practical sequence of it, about where he could hire labor and what materials would cost. Grace had built a portion of her own house and knew what was involved, and they talked about it practically and companionably while the sun moved lower and the shadows stretched east across his land. "I'll need help with some of it," he said. "I'm a fair carpenter but not a master one. Some of the structural work needs more hands." "I know men who can help," Grace said. "I'll make introductions." He looked at her. "Thank you." It was a small thing, but it was not a small thing, and they both knew it. October came, and with it the comfortable rhythm of what was developing between them. The Sunday afternoons, the supper every other week or so, the way he would ride over if something needed 2 people to manage it, and the way she would ride over to the parcel across the creek and watch the house taking shape under the careful work of Roscoe's hands. He was building it himself, largely, with help from a local carpenter named Abe Morton on the structural elements, and the pace of it was slow and deliberate, the pace of someone building something meant to last. Clara had stopped pretending that she did not know what was happening between her mother and Roscoe Boone. She had the perceptive directness of a child who had been raised by a woman who valued honesty, and one evening in October she said to Grace, "Are you and Mr. Boone going to get married?" with a combination of curiosity and hopefulness that made Grace's heart constrict painfully. "That is a very large question, Clara," Grace said. "I know," Clara said. "But you like him." "I do like him," Grace said, because there was no point in pretending otherwise to a 10-year-old with sharp eyes. "And he likes you," Clara said, with the confident authority of someone who had reached a conclusion through careful observation and saw no point in beating around the bush. "He looks at you the way Papa used to look at you in the photographs." Grace stood very still for a moment, feeling the weight of that, the complicated layered weight of loss and time and new things growing in the space that old things had left. "You wouldn't mind," she asked, "if things changed, if someone new became important?" Clara was quiet for a moment with the seriousness of a child working through something real. Then she said, "Papa's not coming back, I know that. I've known that for a long time." Her voice was steady and it broke Grace's heart in the most loving way. "And Mr. Boone doesn't try to be Papa. He's just himself. I like that." Grace crossed the room and held her daughter for a long time, longer than was strictly necessary, feeling the particular fierceness of loving something you had helped build from the beginning. In November, the house across the creek was finished enough to be habitable, and Roscoe moved in on a cold, clear morning and lit the first fire in the hearth of the house he had built on land he owned for the first time in his life. And that evening, he walked across the creek in the dark to Grace's house and knocked on her door, and she opened it and looked at him standing in her doorway in the lamplight. "I lit the fire," he said simply. "I know," she said. "I saw the smoke." He came inside, and she gave him coffee, and they sat by her fire while the wind moved outside. And Clara came downstairs in her nightgown, because she had heard voices and Roscoe told her about the house, and she asked 17 questions about the fireplace in the kitchen, and whether there was a room for guests. And Grace watched them from across the table, and felt the thing in her chest settle into something that was not the ache she had lived with for 6 years, but its opposite, not absence but presence. Not loneliness but fullness. It was the first week of December when he kissed her. They were on her porch in the cold, watching a light snow come down. The first snow of winter, thin and tentative, the kind that wouldn't stick but mattered all the same because it meant the season had properly turned. Grace had her coat wrapped around her, and her breath was making small clouds in the cold air, and they had been talking about something she could not afterward remember the specifics of, some practical thing about cattle feeding through the winter, and then they were not talking. He had turned toward her and she had turned toward him, and the movement between them was so natural and unhurried that afterward she could not have said exactly when it began, only that it did, and that when he kissed her it was careful and warm and entirely serious, the way he did everything, and that it undid something in her that she had been holding tightly for a very long time. She kissed him back with the full, honest acknowledgement of something she had been feeling for months, and when they separated they stood close together in the thin snow with the cold around them and the warmth between them, and Grace thought that she was not afraid anymore. She had been afraid, she realized it now, had been afraid that loving someone again meant risking the specific kind of devastation she had survived once. But standing here with Roscoe Boone's hands holding both of hers and the snow coming down so gently around them, the fear felt small and distant compared to everything else. "Grace," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and hearing it in his voice felt like something being completed. "Roscoe," she said and smiled, and he laughed, a real laugh, full and warm, and she thought she had not heard him laugh like that before and that it was one of the finest sounds she had ever heard. The winter was cold and manageable, and they spent a great deal of it in each other's company, moving between the two properties naturally, sharing the kinds of tasks that were easier with two, building the kind of daily partnership that is more revealing of two people's compatibility than any number of dinners or conversations. Because in the daily texture of working together you learn whether someone is patient or irritable, whether they listen or dismiss, whether they are honest when honesty requires something of them. Roscoe Boone, Grace found, was patient and honest and listened with his whole attention, and when he was wrong about something he said so without making an occasion of it, and when she was wrong about something she said so in return, and neither of them made the other feel small for having been wrong. They disagreed sometimes. Not often, but sometimes, and the disagreements were instructive because they revealed the shape of each other's thinking, and what Grace found was that even when they disagreed, the disagreement felt like two people taking something seriously rather than like a contest for dominance. He never dismissed her judgment or implied that she did not know her own business. She never dismissed his experience or implied that she had no use for another perspective. They had found between them a way of being with each other that honored what they each were individually, and Grace thought this was rarer than most people admitted. In January, he asked her to marry him. He did it in the simplest possible way, without ceremony or elaborate staging, which she appreciated because she would have been embarrassed by elaborate staging. They were walking back from the barn on a cold evening after checking on the cattle, the stars enormous overhead in the winter dark, their breath making clouds, and he stopped and turned toward her and said, "I want to ask you something." She stopped and looked at him. She knew, from his expression and the particular quality of his stillness, what he was about to ask, and she felt something that was all warmth, no fear, and thought with quiet wonder that she had not expected to feel that way. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to build something here with you and Clara. Not to manage what you've built it and it's yours, and I know that better than you know I know it, but alongside you, as a partner." Because I think we're better at this life together than either of us is alone, and I think you're the most remarkable person I have met in 36 years of living, and I have loved you since probably that first Sunday afternoon when you asked what kind of man bounced a question back to the person who asked it. Grace was quiet for a moment, looking up at him in the starlight. You told me I already knew the answer, she said. You did, he said. You always do. I just never want you to forget it. She stepped toward him and took his face in her cold hands and kissed him, which he seemed to take as the answer it was, and then she said, against his mouth, yes. Yes, Roscoe, yes. And he held her in the cold January night under those enormous Texas stars, and they stood that way for a long time, warm against the cold, full against the dark. Clara, when they told her the following morning, asked 3 questions in rapid succession. Whether she could be in the wedding, whether Roscoe was going to move into their house or whether they were all going to the one across the creek, and whether she could call him something other than Mr. Boone now. You can be in the wedding, Grace said. You can wear the blue dress. We'll all live here, Roscoe said. Your mama has built the best house and the best ranch in this county, and there is no reason on earth to leave it. I'll keep the parcel across the creek and we'll work both, but this is home. Clara looked at him with those sharp dark eyes. And the third thing, whatever you want to call me, Roscoe said, that is entirely your decision and I will answer to whatever you choose. Clara thought about it with great seriousness for a full day and came back with Roscoe, which she delivered with an air of finality, having apparently decided that a name she had been saying for months was the most natural thing, and that it suited them both for her to use it without formality. He accepted this with complete seriousness, and she was satisfied. They were married in the spring, in the small church in Caldwell, on a warm April morning with the bluebonnets coming in along the road and the sky an impossible clear blue, the kind that Texas put on for special occasions. Grace wore a dress of pale ivory cotton that the town dressmaker had made, nothing elaborate but fitted well and soft, and she carried wildflowers from her own land. And when she walked down the aisle toward Roscoe Boone standing at the front of that small church, she felt no grief and no fear, and no weight of the past 6 years, only the clean, full certainty of a person moving toward exactly what was right. He looked at her as she came toward him with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, the expression of a man who could not quite believe his own good fortune and was not going to pretend otherwise. And she thought that this was the thing about Roscoe Boone that she had loved from the very beginning, even before she knew she loved it. He did not pretend. He saw things clearly and he said what was true, and he looked at her exactly as she was and found it enough, found it more than enough. The minister said the words and they said them back to each other, and when they were pronounced husband and wife and Roscoe kissed her, Clara, standing beside them as she had requested, said finally, under her breath in a voice that was clearly audible to both of them and to the first 3 rows of the congregation, and the resulting laughter made it the finest wedding Grace had ever attended. Hank Dewhurst, who had known Roscoe first and felt a proprietary pride in the outcome, hosted the wedding supper at his place, and half the county came. And it was noisy and warm and full of the particular frontier generosity of people who had built lives in hard country and understood what it meant to celebrate something good when something good came along. Grace danced with Roscoe in the firelight of the Dewhurst yard, while a fiddler played something slow and sweet, and she thought about the morning 6 years ago when she had stood at Thomas's grave in the cold October morning and made herself a promise, and she thought about all the mornings after that, the difficult ones and the ordinary ones, and the ones that had been saved from impossible by nothing more than her own stubbornness. And she thought about a man on a bay horse pulling up at her fence line and saying that her pump needed work. Small moments, she thought. Everything begins with the smallest moments, and you cannot always tell when they are happening which ones will matter. She said this to Roscoe later that night, standing on their porch in the spring air, the sounds of the celebration still audible in the distance, the stars out and enormous. He listened to the whole of it and then he said, I knew from the fence. The fence, she asked. The morning I came to look at the pump, he said. You were fixing a fence when I arrived. You had your sleeves rolled up and you were concentrating, and you didn't stop what you were doing to come see who was arriving. You just looked up, assessed, and went back to work. He paused. I thought, there is a woman who doesn't perform anything. I knew from that moment. Grace looked at him in the dark. You came back with the parts, she said. I was going to come back regardless, he admitted. The parts were a useful reason. She laughed, surprised and delighted, and he laughed too, and they stood together on the porch that was now equally both of theirs and listened to the spring night. And Grace thought that this, exactly this, was what she had been building toward all along without ever knowing it. The first year of their marriage was the kind of year that sets the foundation for all the years that follow. Not perfect, nothing is perfect, but solid and warm and honestly lived, with the particular texture of two people learning the daily grammar of sharing a life. Roscoe managed both parcels with the same thoughtful attention he brought to everything, and the ranch expanded in quiet, deliberate ways over the following months, not by dramatic leaps, but by the steady accumulation of good decisions made together. They talked about everything. They disagreed when they disagreed and found resolutions that usually turned out to be better than either of their original positions. Roscoe had a particular gift for the mechanical and structural work that Grace had always managed less efficiently, and Grace had the deeper knowledge of the land and the cattle and the county that Roscoe's newness to the place had not yet developed, and between them they covered what each one could not do alone. Grace noticed, as the months passed, that the particular exhaustion she had carried for 6 years, the weight of sole responsibility, the loneliness of being the only one who would ever know why a decision had been made, had lifted in a way she had not fully anticipated. She had not realized how much of her energy had been consumed by being the only one who knew all the things, the only one who held the whole picture, until there was another person holding it with her. She was still the one who knew this land best, still the one whose gut read the seasons with the accumulated knowledge of years. She still made most of the calls on the cattle and the grazing and the water management. Roscoe did not diminish any of that. He simply held the other half of the weight, and under that distribution she found that she could think more clearly, plan further ahead, and sleep more deeply than she had in 6 years. Curtis Hadley made one final attempt in the summer of that year, sending a letter offering an even higher figure for the combined properties now that she and Roscoe owned adjacent parcels. Grace showed Roscoe the letter over breakfast, watching his face. He read it carefully and then looked up at her with the ghost of that almost smile. "What does your gut say?" he asked. She took the letter from him and set it directly in the kitchen stove, and he watched it burn with an expression of complete satisfaction. "Good," he said, and poured her coffee, and that was the last they heard of Curtis Hadley. In the autumn of their first married year, Grace discovered she was expecting a child. She told Roscoe on a September evening, directly and without preamble, because she had never been able to approach important things obliquely. She watched his face as she said it, and saw the succession of things that moved across its surprise, and then something that was not quite shock but close to it. And then, settling over everything like light coming through a cloud, a joy so unguarded and complete that she felt her eyes fill without warning. He crossed the room and held her, not saying anything for a moment, just holding her, and then he said quietly, "Are you all right?" "I'm very all right," she said into his shoulder. "And you're not frightened?" She considered this honestly. "A little," she admitted. "I was very frightened with Clara, and I had Thomas then. Everything was more uncertain." She pulled back to look at him. "But I'm not frightened the way I was alone. Being frightened with someone is different from being frightened alone." "It is," he said. He touched her face with a gentleness that she had come to know was him at his most serious, and said, "I'm going to be here for every single moment of it, all of it." She believed him, because she had known for a year now that when Roscoe Boone told you something it was true, and that his word was the most reliable thing in her life after the land itself. Clara received the news with a thoughtful pause followed by the declaration that she wanted a brother, which she stated as though this settled the matter, and then went immediately to work planning the various ways in which she intended to educate a younger sibling, starting with her own current school spelling list. The pregnancy went well through the autumn and the winter, and Roscoe was, as promised, present for everything. He learned what she needed before she had to ask, when she needed quiet and when she needed company, when the work was too much, and when doing the work herself was important to her in a way that was not about practicality, but about being who she was. He did not wrap her in careful cotton or suggest that her condition changed what she was capable of. He simply paid attention and adjusted accordingly, which was all she had ever wanted from anyone. The baby arrived in the last week of April, almost exactly a year after their wedding, which felt, Grace thought, as though the universe was being pleasingly symmetrical. It was a boy. He arrived on a Tuesday morning with considerably more drama than his sister had produced, in a process that left Grace tired and wrung out but completely intact, with Roscoe holding her hand through most of it and the town's midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Ruiz, managing the practical aspects with calm expertise. When the midwife placed the baby in Grace's arms and Grace looked at her son for the first time, red-faced and furious and entirely complete. She felt the same particular love she had felt when Clara was born, enormous and specific, the love that comes from having made a whole person. Roscoe sat beside her with his elbows on his knees, and his hands clasped and looked at his son with an expression that Grace thought was the finest thing she had ever seen on a human face, the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he had stopped believing he would reach. "Hello," he said to the baby, in the quiet voice he used for serious things. The baby was naturally unresponsive to this greeting, being occupied with more immediate concerns, but Grace thought he would appreciate it later. Clara, when she was brought in, looked at her brother with the critical appraisal of a girl who had requested a brother and was now examining whether the delivered article met specifications. After a thorough inspection, she said, "He's very small." "He'll get bigger," Grace said. "I'll teach him the spelling list as soon as he can hold a pencil," Clara announced, with the serene confidence of someone whose plans were immovable, and Grace laughed, even though laughing after what she had just been through was something of an accomplishment. They named him Thomas James Boone, Thomas for the father who had built the land he would grow up on, James for Roscoe's own father, and Boone for the man who sat beside his mother's bed with the look of someone who had found everything he had been looking for. The name felt right. Not a replacement, not an erasure, but a continuation of something, the acknowledgement that the people who had come before were part of this story too, that grief and love did not cancel each other out but existed together, layered and honest. That summer, the ranch was the fullest it had ever been in cattle, in production, in the simple human fullness of a family that had come together through loss and work, and the willingness of two honest people to see each other clearly. The parcel across the creek was running cattle under Roscoe's management, and the original Merriweather land was producing at its best levels since Thomas had first broken the ground. When the county held its annual Stockman's Fair in September, Grace entered 3 of her cattle in the competition and took 2 ribbons, which she accepted with the unshowy satisfaction of someone who had known all along and was pleased to have it confirmed. Roscoe watched from the fence with Clara on one side and Thomas in his arms, and when Grace walked back across the fairground with the ribbons in her hand and caught his eye, he simply looked at her with that expression she had been cataloging for 2 years now, that particular warm and direct regard that said, "I see you and I think you are extraordinary." She stopped in front of him. "Well," she said. "Well," he said, "you already knew you were going to win." "I did," she agreed, and tucked one ribbon through Thomas's small fist where he promptly attempted to eat it, and she laughed, and Roscoe laughed, and Clara said, "He does that with everything," with the weary authority of a sisterly elder, and the sun came down warm on all 4 of them in the September light of the fair ground. In the years that followed, the Boone Ranch became one of the most respected small operations in Harlan County. Not the largest, not the most dramatic, but consistently well-managed and consistently productive. The kind of place that other ranchers pointed to when they wanted an example of what careful, patient husbandry looked like over time. Grace managed the cattle with the same deep knowledge she had been building since her first years on the land, and as the years passed, she found that she could trust her instincts more completely, not because they had changed, but because she had built years of evidence for them, and because she no longer had to carry the self-doubt that came with carrying everything alone. Roscoe's steady partnership had not made her less herself, had not diminished any of the capabilities she had forged in 6 hard years. It had simply removed the weight of the solitude, and in the absence of that weight she found she could be more of herself, not less. She thought about this sometimes on quiet evenings on the porch, about the version of herself she had been in those 6 years, the woman who made every decision alone and drove every post and figured every angle and refused every offer of help because help felt dangerous, felt like the beginning of the end of the self she had built. She did not regret those years. They had made her, but she was grateful, with a fullness she had not expected to feel again, that they had ended. She was grateful for a pump that broke on the right morning and a man who noticed it from the road. She was grateful for a question bounced back to her with the simple trust that she already knew the answer. She was grateful for 2 warm brown eyes that had looked at her, from the very beginning, as though what they saw was worth the looking. Clara grew into the sharp, capable young woman that her birth had promised, and at 17 was already the best reader of cattle weather in the county after her mother, and had her grandfather Thomas's talent for planning and her stepfather's talent for paying attention, and had the added gift of both of them together working as an example of what a good life built on honesty and mutual respect looked like. Thomas Jr., who was universally called Tom, was 5 when Grace found out that she was expecting again, which she announced at the breakfast table with the directness she brought to all such matters. And Tom received this news with the cheerful indifference of a 5-year-old who had not yet developed any real theory about what such things meant. And Clara looked up from her biscuit with an expression of pleased calculation and said, "I want a sister this time," with the precise same authority with which she had previously declared her preference for a brother. Roscoe looked at Grace across the breakfast table with those warm brown eyes and said, "Well, we'll see what the universe has to say about that." The universe produced a daughter, born the following spring, who came into the world considerably more quietly than her brother had, and who looked up at the assembled Boone family from the first moments of her life, with a composed and measuring gaze that Roscoe said was entirely her mother's. They named her Mary, simple and solid, and Clara was ecstatic, and Tom regarded his new sister with the benign tolerance of someone who had been enthusiastic about many things before, and understood that enthusiasm would eventually be required of him here too. The spring after Mary's birth, Grace was on the porch in the early morning, the kind of morning that Texas offered sometimes in May, when the air was warm and soft and smelled of grass and distant rain, and the land spread out before her in the first light, green and gold and completely itself. Roscoe came out of the house behind her and stood beside her with his coffee, shoulder to shoulder, looking at their land, the creek shining in the early light, the cattle moving in the north pasture, the fence lines clean and straight, the house across the creek that was now used as a secondary residence for hired hands and storage, and the occasional visiting neighbor. "Do you remember the morning you came to my fence?" Grace asked. "I remember everything from that day," he said, "including the look you gave me when I mentioned the pump." "What look was that?" "The one that said, 'I know about my pump, thank you, and I will manage it myself,'" Grace smiled. "I would have managed it myself." "You would have," he agreed with complete sincerity. "You would have figured it out eventually, and it would have worked, and you would have done it alone and been right to be proud of it." "But it was better with help," she said. "Most things are," he said. "The right kind of help from the right person." She turned to look at him, this man who had ridden past her fence on a random morning and come back because Hank Dewhurst talked too much and because, she suspected now, he had seen something in her that morning that he had already been looking for without knowing it. This man who had given her back her own certainty when she had begun to doubt it. This man who had built a house on the other side of her creek and made it his home. "I'm glad you came back with the parts," she said. He turned to her, and in the early light of that May morning his face held all the warmth and all the years and all the mornings between that first one and this one, and he reached up and touched her face the way he always did when he was being most himself, and he said, "I was always going to come back, Grace. Even if there had been nothing wrong with your pump, I was always going to come back." She leaned into him, and they stood together in the warm spring morning and looked at everything they had built, which was considerable, and which would outlast both of them in the land and in the children, and in the example of two people who had found each other on the far side of loss and had chosen, with their eyes open and their hearts honest, to build something new. The bluebonnets were coming in along the road again. The cattle were healthy. The creek was running clear. Inside the house, Mary was beginning to wake, her small sounds drifting through the open window, and in a few minutes Tom would come downstairs at his usual velocity, and Clara would already be at the table with a book, because Clara was always already at the table with a book, and the ordinary beautiful morning would begin. Grace Merriweather, Grace Boone now, though she kept Merriweather for the ranch, and no one in the county found this strange took one long breath of the morning air, and felt the land that had claimed her and the life she had built on it, and felt the man beside her who had made all of it fuller and warmer and better than it had been when she had carried it alone. She had made every decision alone for 6 years. She had been right to make them and strong enough to carry them, and nobody could take that from her. And she had been loved for knowing her own mind by a man who had never once tried to take that mind from her, who had only ever trusted it and stood beside it, and held the other half of the weight so she could carry hers more freely. The morning deepened, and the shadows moved, and the world went on, as it always did, as it always would, as it had been doing since before either of them arrived and would continue long after they were gone. And Grace Boone stood in the warm Texas spring, and thought that she was, in the fullest possible sense of the word, exactly where she was supposed to be. Inside, Tom's footsteps hit the stairs at the customary speed, and Clara said something from the kitchen in the even voice of an older sibling managing a situation, and Mary made a sound of decisive wakefulness from the bedroom, and Roscoe laughed beside her, low and warm. The laugh she had thought was one of the finest sounds she had ever heard on the evening she first heard it. "Day's starting," he said. "Day's starting," she agreed. They went inside together, into the warmth and the noise and the fullness of the life they had made, and the door closed behind them, and the morning continued, golden and unhurried, over the good Texas land.